How a people are governed is obviously one of the most profound issues in any election. We were very worried yesterday by a story in the Financial Times, which seemed to be very well sourced, and quoted sources close to Nick Clegg, saying that his party would be prepared to support David Cameron's plan for an in-out referendum, but only under certain circumstances, that Mr Clegg would have an influence in deciding the question asked, the precise timing of the referendum, the scope of the franchise for the referendum, which was the most worrying thing of all, demanding that 16 and 17-year-olds take part, and more especially that EU migrants are entitled to vote. We've had about 1 million EU migrants in this parliamentary term alone. We would like David Cameron to come clean about exactly what discussions he has or has not had with Nick Clegg in the Quad or in wider coalition circles. We would like him to guarantee that none of these demands would be met, that Mr Clegg will not have a hand in the question, the timing, and that there is no question whatsoever of the franchise being changed from a general election franchise, because in the case of 16 and 17-year-olds, they're far more likely to have been exposed recently to very strident pro-EU views and not to have heard the Eurosceptic case at all. And in the case of EU migrants, there is obviously a vested interest potentially in how they will vote. We see this as an attempt by the Liberal Democrats to gerrymander the outcome, but we are also worried that David Cameron has a habit of letting the Liberal Democrats take the rap for certain unconservative things he might be planning to do. So we call on David Cameron to come clean on exactly what discussions he's had with Mr Clegg and other Liberal Democrats about this issue, and to categorically rule out 16 and 17-year-olds voting and EU migrants voting in the British people's referendum on how they are governed. Thank you very much. I'm just going to sit down and we'll take questions on this and other matters.
Sorry, Ben Glaze, Daily Mirror. You say 16 and 17-year-olds have been more widely exposed to pro-European views. Why do you say that?
Well, there have been lots of stories, perhaps not many in your newspaper, Ben, but in other newspapers, about the extent of EU funding of publicity material that's got into schools. And we've had many reports, anecdotally, through our members of school children of secondary school age being exposed to overwhelmingly pro-EU views when the matter of the European Union is discussed, and not really having the Eurosceptic or the anti-EU case put. And let's be frank about it, opinion research shows that 16 and 17-year-olds are much more likely to be in support of Britain's membership of the European Union than is the population in general. And the electoral franchise does not allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, and it's no wonder the Liberal Democrats wish to make this change, but it's a gerrymandering change which is clearly intended to skew the result.
But don't you want it banned for the same reason? You don't want them to have a say because they will vote to stay in the EU?
Well, the status quo of the franchise is surely the fairest way to go. As it happens, I'm very strongly against 16 and 17-year-olds being allowed to vote. I think they're too young. You know, there has to be an age limit, and I think turning 18 is the right one.
Yes, and can I say that is our view across the patch. It's not just about trying to prevent 16 or 17-year-olds having a say in any potential EU referendum. It's our view that they should not be voting in any election. It's too young.
Chris Hope, Telegraph. Can you give more detail on what the material is? Is it like TV programmes, or is it like First News, or what are you talking about exactly on this kind of exposed to material?
We can share the answer, but at risk mentioning a rival, the Daily Express has had some very good stories actually exposing literature from the European Commission or the European Parliament that's been circulated in schools, which is, heavily pro-EU, slanted, without, any balancing on the other side.
I mean, you walk into Europe House, you can go and have a look at some of the literature for yourself. It's everything there from colouring in books on the Common Agricultural Policy for primary school children, right up to research projects at university level. The amount of money that the EU is putting into this propaganda and throughout the entire education system is enormous.
Well, hang on, Michael. How much are you talking about? Is it a small budget? A lot of money being...
I don't know exactly what the budget is, but as I say, if you walk into Europe House and you look at the literature that's there, you can see that there's considerable sums on it. We do know that overall, the European Union has a budget, an advertising budget, that's larger than that of Coca-Cola. So it's not exactly something that they do shout about their particular viewpoint constantly.
Do you know a 16-year-old that uses a colouring book?
Andrew, I think we're sort of slightly confusing the issue here. I'm saying that it is propaganda that goes in right from... I did, but I wasn't talking about 16 and 17-year-olds. I'm talking about the influence it's had from a very, very early age in our school. That was my point.
I think the colouring books apply at primary school level because they like to catch them young.
Exactly.
They can't vote, though.
They're not going to get the vote, are they?
Well,
It's
if Sir Malcolm Bruce had his way, I don't know how low he would lower the age range, but our point is that the franchise should not be doctored for this referendum, and our key demand is that David Cameron now comes clean about what he is prepared to do and give his reassurances that we will get a fair referendum. And we say it's another proof that you need a good number of UKIP MPs in the House of Commons to keep this referendum honest.
Do you agree that some children in areas of high migration are frightened about playing football because of it?
This is in relation to Nigel's comment yesterday about wanting a society at ease with itself where kids can play football.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think probably the biggest factor of children not playing football in the street is the amount of traffic, it has to be said, right? But I do also think that very fast pace of immigration, uncontrolled, does put pressure on community cohesion and lead not just to children but to parents worrying about the public spaces and the safety and familiarity.
But why would they worry about the public spaces? What are they worried about?
Well, if you're in a community where everyone knows each other, and the local children are all friends and have had time to get to know each other, they're more likely to A, be able to arrange a game of football with each other, and B, to feel completely safe about going out and playing it. I would suggest that seems like common sense to me.
Well, I mean, you could say most parts of London, people don't know each other.
That's right.
It has nothing to do with migration.
Well, no, that's a challenge for London. I think, everyone goes on about London being this amazingly successful, integrated, young professional community. But I think there are actually some statistics, I think I heard Trevor Phillips talk about this, that shows, in fact, that the number of segregated communities in London is quite high, and the amount of mixing between communities is really rather low. So, yeah, I think it applies to London as well. That's right.
Mr. O'Flynn, Bettina Prendergast, Austrian Television. I'm a so-called EU migrant. I've been living here for 10 years. I'm married to a British citizen.
Yep.
Would you exclude me from an EU referendum vote as well? Or does it only apply to people who have been only in the country for 2 minutes?
Well, are you entitled to vote in British general elections?
I'm not, because I keep my Austrian passport.
Right. Well, we think the franchise for the European referendum should be the same franchise as for a British general election. We think that's the fairest way. That would be evidence that no one is trying to doctor the result or gerrymander the ballot. So I'm afraid I don't think you should be allowed to vote in the referendum.
Shame. Andrew Neil, BBC Television. In recent weeks, UKIP's gone from having no net migration target to a 50,000 net migration target, now to a 30,000 net migration target. Is the aim to get to zero migration by May the 7th, or are you just making it up as you go along?
There are no net migration targets. I think this is a media confection. I really do, Andrew. He was talking about what might be an ideal. He was talking about a return to normality. He said frequently that what he wants to get to on migration is a return to normality, which is what he perceives as being between the 1950s and 2000. Well, it depends how you define a target, doesn't it? We say that we are going to have an Australian-style point system, which means that people will be let in if they have skills that they can offer to Britain, if they can support themselves and any dependents they bring with them for at least a period of 5 years. And on that basis, the numbers will be what the numbers will be, and the numbers will be in the best interests of Britain. And I think too many politicians have tried to hoodwink the public over the past decade or so, talking about numbers, talking about targets which are unrealistic and can't be met.
So when your migration spokesman, Mr. Wolfe, told me on the Daily Politics that the target was 50,000, he's your migration spokesman, by the way, he was wrong.
Well, he was, I think, expressing his own personal opinion about what might be reasonable.
Spokesman.
Well, I can tell you that there won't be any mention of 50,000 or 30,000 in the manifesto, and that will be the official party policy.
So UKIP has no migration target
That's right.
for your most important policy.
It's an important policy, but again, we said we don't want to be distracted by targets. The problem with immigration, nobody in UKIP is opposed to immigration. We are opposed to immigration that is not the right sort of immigration that we want, and that's what we'll be focusing on through the Australian-style policy.
Vote UKIP, and you've no idea how many immigrants will come to this country.
No, I think that's, you know, it's very, very cleverly put, but not fair at all. Make no mistake, we will be the party of much lower immigration. Just the moratorium on unskilled immigration, looking at recent data, will take about 150,000 people a year out of net migration, just that measure alone.
Is that a target?
And well, you can call it what you want. That's what it will do. And the Australian-style point system, we're actually going to be even more rigorous because, as Stephen Wolfe laid out very well last month, we are not going to be like Australia, which says if you clear these published hurdles, you will definitely get in. If you clear the hurdles, you will be considered for entry, but we're going to set up a Migration Control Commission, which will consider very carefully the scale of migration that the country either needs or can cope with. And our point is that Britain needs smart immigration, not mass immigration. And I think we've really set the pace on the argument that even migrants who come to work because of our very expensive welfare state, which we all want to preserve, and because of our extensive public services, and because of our in-work benefit system, that if you come from abroad to work for a major corporation and you get into a minimum wage job, you're probably only paying, at the moment, probably down to about £400 a year income tax, and there's a broad agreement that may end up as zero by the end of the next Parliament, or very little. You might pay the same again in national insurance, but you'll have access to housing benefit, you'll have access to tax credits. If you even have one child, that will be £1,000 in child benefit, let alone school places and the strain you place on, you know, the roads, the schools, the police. You're hollowing out the public realm and adding to the public sector deficit. It's all a very nice, cosy setup for the big corporations, I'm sure, but it's not in the national interest, and it makes the deficit worse. So that's why our system will guarantee that the people who come are the people with the skills, the investment, who also believe in British values and can be a massive benefit to our country. Now, none of the other parties can match that because they all believe in keeping in the EU, which means, as Angela Merkel has instructed David Cameron, a complete open door to more than 400 million people.
Patrick, would you characterise what the EU is doing in schools as brainwashing?
I'm trying to remember whether I've characterised it as that in the past. I think it's not a million miles away. It's certainly designed to catch people young and feed them propaganda and a very partial view, which you know, just speaks up to the EU being an unalloyed good thing that we couldn't possibly do without.
So you would characterise it as brainwashing, yes?
All right, I think well, it is an emotive term, but you seem to be inviting me. I wouldn't demur from the description of brainwashing.
But you would, Suzanne. You wouldn't call it.
I think I prefer propaganda, but I think we're fairly close on the view, on the same view.
Hello. I wondered whether we could get a response on the letter to the Telegraph from the 100 business leaders, and a thought perhaps about whether any of those business leaders in your minds might consider supporting UKIP?
Well, we'd invite support from wherever it may come. The point about the business leaders' letter, I think it's not a surprise, because Labour has a dreadful record both on the economy in general and on the public finances. Now, we in UKIP have absolutely no plans to reverse the coalition's cuts in corporation tax, which I think the letter specifically endorsed and welcomed. We've also endorsed the Treasury's deficit elimination schedule and pledged that UKIP MPs in the next Parliament will be a voice for fiscal responsibility. So I am not surprised to see business leaders steer a wide path away from the Labour Party. However, I also think that just rounding up 100 business names and saying that George Osborne's a jolly good chap might not be the boon that it might once have been for the Conservative Party, because there are profound questions about the way our economy works and about living standards for ordinary British working people, and indeed about corporate tax dodging too. So what we're going to seek to show in this election campaign is that UKIP can be the one party which both has a pro-business agenda and a commitment to creating a fairer economy.
But which, if any, big business leaders are supporting UKIP?
Well, look, I think the way this election has been played or defined is that UKIP probably isn't going to wake up on May the 8th as the party of government, and both the major parties are trying to define it in a binary way. So I don't think we particularly hunted for a big business leader to say vote UKIP. And to be quite frank, because of our policy on unskilled migration from the EU, which is such an easy way for corporates to turn a profit, I would be surprised whether many of those big business people would support us. And particularly, the big corporate sector is also overwhelmingly in favour of European Union membership for that reason that I just mentioned, but also for certain tax advantages. They're entitled under EU and EEA arrangements to channel profits through whatever jurisdiction they wish to. And not surprisingly, many have chosen micro jurisdictions like Luxembourg with sweetheart, very, very low corporation tax rates. So, I don't mind that we're going to have an argument with big business ourselves. I just think it's a better argument than the Labour Party has.
Darren McCaffrey from Sky News. The truth be told, though, there's no way you could even get anywhere close to 100 business leaders supporting UKIP. In fact, could you even get 3 prominent business leaders to support UKIP?
I think we probably could get 3, but I've got a lot of other things on my plate today, so...
Yeah, who?
We can't name them without asking their permission, you know that. But I tell you what we could do. We could probably get several thousand small businessmen and women to sign up to UKIP, because they are the ones that feel the weight of the EU regulations. They're the ones that simply can't afford to take on the full-time staff to deal with the administration and the regulations and the red tape that the EU puts on them. They're the ones who spend years developing product lines which then get regulated out of existence, and they see them taken over by the big corporates. They're the ones that don't get paid by the big businesses that support the European Union. And our manifesto promises to small businesses, I think, will be second to none. They will certainly beat the other parties hollow.
In fact,
100 chief executives, are they top 500 chief
well, look,
executives?
As I said to you earlier, I don't think it's a surprise that the FTSE 100 executive class is quite happy with the status quo. If you look, I think this was a point Andrew made to someone recently, if you look at their remuneration packages and how they've been going up over the last 5 or 10 years, Britain is pretty cushy for them, isn't it? It's not for millions of ordinary working people. And Suzanne's quite right to say we could get several thousand small business people to support us. And I know that because we have several thousand small business people as members of our party. We are the party of small business. To use that old, I think it was a nursery rhyme, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers. UKIP members are more likely than any other party members to have actually set up a business and be running a business. And I've spoken myself to hundreds of them all around the country. And the small business sector, I think, has been overlooked, and under prioritised in this country, and is most likely to create most of the new jobs. And we're unashamedly, if we have to choose between the corporatist status quo and promoting a proper free market where new startups can compete with the big boys, then we'll go for the latter.
Well, we look forward to interviewing the candlestick makers in the weeks to come. Just on zero-hour contracts, do you support Ed Miliband's moves this morning to clamp down on them?
Nigel Farage, a year ago, raised the issue of exploitation in the zero-hours contracts sector and the very fast growth of it, and said he was worried about it. And we propose some tough restrictions on zero-hours contracts. We say that I think actually everyone's agreed with one thing, which is no exclusivity from an employer to an employee on a zero-hours contract. We also say there should be a minimum 12-hour notice period for a shift, and that doesn't sound long, does it? But basically, if you're required at 8 o'clock the next morning, you need to be told before 8 o'clock that evening. And that actually comes to light after some of our public meetings during the European election campaign. We had people coming up to us and reporting instances of companies which were actually getting workers to turn up the next morning dressed for work to be told whether there was any work for them, which reeks of, you know, dockers in the 1930s. And actually, you know, one of the companies mentioned to me that was doing this is a household name I won't name because it's a secondary source rather than the primary source, but a very reliable source mentioned that to me. And that was something that certainly concerned UKIP and Nigel Farage, and we think that's totally unacceptable. We also think that after a year on a zero-hours contract, an employee should be able to demand a fixed hours contract or a permanent post, although we would exempt small businesses from that restriction because it's much more difficult for small businesses to manage staffing than it is for very large companies, which, you know, should be able to do that. So yes, we share a lot of the criticisms, and the government, I think, says that 1.6% only of jobs in the economy are 0 hours. But we think that in terms of the new jobs being created in the last 2 or 3 years, the percentage is much higher, actually. And although the data is not complete, you could be looking at 10% or more of the jobs being 0 hours. And that certainly worries us, and it's often not a good thing for planning family life if that's the only work that's available.
Hello, sorry, Alex from BBC News. You say 10% of the jobs are 0 hours. How many of those are being offered by small businesses and therefore would be exempt by your policy? And just secondly, if you are the party of small business, I presume you'll commit to cutting business rates?
Yes, absolutely. We will be cutting business rates for small business, and you'll see exactly what we plan to do for that in our manifesto. In terms of small businesses on 0 hours contracts, I don't know what the numbers are, but let's look at one particular example. If you're a very small business, perhaps 1 or 2 employees, if you're a sole trader trying to set up on your own, you want to take somebody on and have that flexibility, and you'll be able to do that within the terms of the controls that we'll be bringing in our manifesto. But under Ed Miliband's terms, you would actually be effectively prevented from hiring anybody. If you're a small startup, you've got problems with cash flow, you don't know whether your business is going to survive, you cannot necessarily take the risk of employing somebody on a full-time basis after just 3 months. So that's why we're giving the exemption to small business, but our terms for 0 hours contracts will absolutely be fair. It's really the big companies that we want to hit here, the big companies whose names have been well mentioned across the press, who are clearly exploiting workers, and that is wrong. The other thing I think that needs to be said is that you can chart the rise of 0 hours contracts from the time when the European Union Temporary Agency Workers Directive came in. 0 hours contracts are big businesses' way of getting around that legislation. And as is often the case with the European Union, they bring in legislation to cure one problem, and it actually leads to another, bigger problem arising.
If I could just add as well that the fundamental issue at the level of the labour market where 0 hours contracts tend to apply is oversupply of labour because of this unrestricted flow from the low-wage economies of southern and eastern Europe. And it's typical of Labour to think of a legislative or bureaucratic solution to a symptom of the problem rather than to address the underlying problem itself. And we say that working people cannot expect rises in pay or better conditions in the economy, while there is this open door and large employers always know that there are people from those low-wage economies who will come and accept worse conditions and accept worse pay, and that is the fundamental issue which is driving these concerns, and how typical of Labour, you know, to seek a bureaucratic, legislative way of dealing with the symptom, which will mean that the disease pops out elsewhere in the economy.
Hi, Arch Singh from PA. Just to go back to our discussion about kids playing football in the street. You mentioned parents were worried about safety because families maybe don't talk to each other as much as they used to. Who's to blame for that?
Well, in any large urban setting, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that fewer people will know each other, there'll be more strangers, there might be less of a sense of social cohesion. Social cohesion is something you need to work on, and you know, the migration aspect means you need to control the volume and give people time to get to know each other, and also to make sure that people coming into your society uphold the core values of that society. So it's not so much a matter of who's to blame, it's a matter of you know, it might well be that all the people coming in have got perfectly, you know, compatible values, but if people don't know each other, the sense of community gets eroded. And I think it was the government's own migration advisory panel, maybe the last government, that has said the pace of change had been too fast, and that does undermine social cohesion. So it undermines, you know, our ability to feel at ease in the communal space.
Can I ask about migration again? This is the only way we can measure your success is by controlling numbers. You're saying that Nigel said, we were there, he said 30 yesterday under the shadow of the White Cliffs Observer. Was he speaking in a personal capacity as well as Steve Wolfe on Radio 5 Live yesterday?
Well, look, I think you're kind of splitting hairs here. We are the party of much lower immigration. Nigel is talking about what his sense, in broad terms, about normality is. Well, David Cameron's talking about tens of thousands and delivering 300,000 because of his open door to the EU.
You say he's broken a promise. Why is that promise and what Nigel is not promised? What's the difference?
Well, because David Cameron said, no ifs, no buts, I'll deliver this. If I don't deliver it, then sack me in 5 years' time. And I think the deadline's coming up for that.
You won't say that.
Well, we say in broad terms, we will lower immigration massively. What we consider normality is what pertained from the immediate post-war period until the mid-1990s.
I mean, it's not just about numbers. We've been talking about community cohesion. You know, it is about culture as well. It's about the change to the face of Britain. And numbers are just one part of the whole immigration story, but the fundamental point needs to be made. The others can talk about numbers as much as they like. The fact is, while we remain a member of the EU, while we remain having open borders, while we have to let, in principle at least, over 500 million other people in the EU in, they cannot control the numbers, and UKIP is the only party that actually has a plan to deal with the numbers.
Siraj Dashi, BuzzFeed. So you mentioned earlier that you were worried about the question about Nick Clegg influencing the EU referendum question. Do you have a question in mind that you'd like to ask voters for the referendum? And secondly, so you had another activist, another candidate who was suspended, who stepped down after he said that Israel should kidnap Barack Obama. Should we expect many more candidates to be stepping down before the election?
Well, I think Nigel has in his book outlined what he thinks might be a potential referendum question. I think he said something like, do you want to be a free sovereign democracy? I think along those lines. I think we're certainly not that at the moment. Obviously, it's something that's up for debate, but he has also said very clearly that it has to be just UK citizens who can vote, and that you know, the question has got to be fair, and clearly what Nick Clegg was proposing isn't.
And it's not party policy to kidnap President Obama?
No. I think we can all be very clear about that. Thanks.
Debates tomorrow night. How's Nigel been preparing, and anyone playing particular roles ahead of that?
I don't think so, not that I know of.
Well, last year, the clashes with Nick Clegg, which you may agree that Nigel probably just about shaded, we didn't have anyone playing Nick Clegg. So that's not really his style, and so we haven't gone round looking for a UKIP Nicola Sturgeon, let alone an Ed Miliband. But of course, you know, he is preparing rigorously, you know, looking over a lot of briefing material, getting in his mind the key arguments he wants to get across. Obviously, this will be the only chance he gets to be on the same stage as David Cameron, and that's David Cameron's doing, not Nigel Farage's. So that again means that there will be key arguments to put there. I mean, there are many things that UKIP believes in uniquely on that panel. We will be the voice for one set of views, and the other 6 might be the voice, you know, despite wanting to create divisions between themselves for a whole load of other stuff that we don't agree with. So he will put our arguments in his normal forthright way.
This is the first time Nigel's met David Cameron in person.
No.
Oh, what secret meetings?
No. They just have. I happen to know they have met a few times over the years.
Are they friends anyway?
I doubt it.
I don't think friend would be the word.
No,
that
I'm
would
sure
come
they're
to
very
mind.
civil to each other. I would hope so anyway.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.